Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. This is Harnessing Technology to Advance Access to Record Clearing. This is a webinar put on by Community Legal Services as part of our National Record Clearing Project, which is funded by the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. My name is Katie Svoboda-Kindle. I'm a staff attorney at Community Legal Services in the employment unit. I'm going to be doing the moderating of this panel. Luckily, we have today with us two lawyers who are going to be talking about technology, because they're not only lawyers, but they're lawyers who can code. So they're going to be talking about programs they've created and different technological solutions that you could implement at your own offices to make your record clearing work more efficient and help more people. So the two presenters we have today are Matthew Stubenberg. He's a researcher at Harvard Law School's Access to Justice Lab. He runs randomized controlled trials there to measure the effectiveness of access to justice interventions. He's also teaches at a law school, teaching coding for lawyers at the University of Baltimore Law School. And he's also used his dual knowledge of coding, programming, and the law to create several legal apps. He's going to be talking about at least one of them today. We also have with us Nate Vogel. He's the Director of Law and Technology at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and he focuses on integrating data and technology into CLS's legal and policy advocacy. So he's also going to be talking about how he has used his dual knowledge of coding and the law to do some work in that capacity as well. Before we begin, I just want to talk a little bit about the logistics of this webinar. First of all, you all should have access to asking questions. Please go ahead and ask a question as soon as it occurs to you. I'm going to be asking some questions during the presentation, and then we're also going to have a Q&A session after the presentation to answer additional questions. We also are going to be having some poll questions today, so I will let you know when it's happening, but at some point we're going to have 3 different poll questions that appear on your screen, and we hope that you will answer those. This webinar is going to be recorded. We will be providing all the materials and the recording in a follow-up email, so you can look forward to that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters to talk to us about harnessing technology.
All right, great, Katie. Well, thank you so much. We are really glad. We're both really glad to be here. I'm excited to talk to everybody about how to use automation to make your record sealing practice more flexible, faster. And we thought it might be a good idea. We're sort of assuming that most or everybody on the call handle a lot of cases. You are engaged in the practice yourself of expunging records, sealing records, maybe educating the public about how to access expungement and sealing services. And maybe you've been doing it a long time and you're really good at it, and you're perhaps used to doing it without using computers in any particular fancy ways. You know, my Microsoft Word, my email work totally fine. So why should I automate anything? What's the point? So we have some thoughts about why automation can be helpful.
Yeah. So I have 3 kind of main reasons why I think automating is kind of worthwhile. So the first is time efficiency, right? Especially with expungement, even if you know exactly what to do, it's still a tedious process in almost every state. And so if you can automate it, you can just speed it up dramatically. The second is the quality of the documents that you produce. And you may be very detail oriented, but if you're producing hundreds and hundreds of expungements, at some point you're copying and pasting from old templates, and you're going to copy the wrong court address, you're going to get the judge's name wrong, whatever it may be, onto whatever documents you're trying to file. And I've done that before, and it's always embarrassing. When you automate something, you can remove a lot of those errors, and you can spend a lot more time on the handful of legal things that can't be automated, or that computers struggle to automate, rather than trying to focus on making sure the date is correct and not the old date from the old form. And the third one is kind of bringing tech to lay people, right? You are only as good as a number of people that you can help in a single day. But if you can convert that to a computer program, you can suddenly turn that and have people help themselves. And the only way to really do that is with automation.
Yeah, I agree, and I want to add about the scale, the scale point that Matthew made. When CLS uh, built software to handle a lot of the expungement workflow many years ago. Mike Hollander, whom some of you may know, wrote this application that we'll talk about more later that was able to automate a large chunk of the expungement workflow. And the unit, the lawyers who were using it at CLS went from being able to handle a handful of cases and within a day to like being able to handle many times more volume, and it like totally transformed the workflow and the scale that the organization was able to operate at. So and then that application, because it's code, you can copy it and you can move it somewhere else pretty easily. We were also able to open it up to other people around the state too. So lots of people are able to benefit from the same automated workflows, and it just can really transform the scale in ways that you'd have to hire a lot of people to be able to do the same thing manually that a good automation process can just scale up better much more quickly. And then the other point that I wanted to mention about another thing that's useful about bringing technology, and especially in web-based technologies, into services like this, is you can reach people in very different ways, in new ways. Folks who might have a hard time accessing you without a convenient digital way to do it will be able to reach you. I did a little analysis of, so CLS until recently depended very heavily on in-person intakes. So people would come to our office, and that's how they got services from us. And I did a comparison of I looked at how far people travel to actually do in-person intake, and people don't travel that far. So with more digital services, we're able to reach people who are physically farther away from the places where we are. And so people who before just couldn't actually get to us have some way to get to us because we've made created some digital gateways into our services. So we wanted to ask everybody a couple of questions to get a sense of who's in the room.
All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and launch a poll right now. Here's the first question, which is, how tech savvy are you? So please select amongst the multiple choices. All right, we're going to go ahead and do the second poll question. Does your organization have a software engineer on staff or retainer? All right, and now the third. Are you considering hiring a software engineer in the next few years? All right, great. Thank you for everyone who has voted. So the results are, how tech savvy are you? We have 48% said, I can use Microsoft Office, but I struggle. 45% said, I'm an advanced Office user using things like mail merge and Excel spreadsheets. We have the next question. Does your organization have a software engineer on staff? Was that the question? Yes, on staff or retainer. 66% said no. All right, and are you considering hiring one? We have 60% said no, 10% said yes, and 31% said we already have one.
Huh. Wow, I'm quite surprised by how many people have a software engineer already work with software engineers. That's very exciting and interesting.
Yeah, a few years ago, that number would have been 0% easily.
Yeah. Huh. Cool. All right. Well, Matt, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I'll start off by talking about what we did in Maryland and how we automated the expungement process there. So, I'm Matthew Stubenberg, and I went to Maryland Law School, and I took expungement law as kind of one of my summer clinics. And I realized that the law itself could be automated, and that this whole process could be sped up a lot quicker. And so when I graduated law school, I tried to look into doing this. And so I kind of want to go over the process of how I determined that expungement could be automated in Maryland, and then a little bit of how we actually did it. So if you don't know, it's mdexpungement.com. And here's the expungement process in Maryland. So you have to look up somebody's criminal cases. You look up each individual case that they have. You analyze it for expungibility. You take that information that is publicly available, and you populate a form with a couple of checkboxes based on the law. You file with the court, and you check to see if it's been removed from the online case lookup website. So in Maryland, we're kind of both. It's a double-edged sword, but in one sense, we're very lucky that court records are available online, and they're available online for free and very quick. And so in Maryland, you can just go to the court's website, type in anybody's name, and you can look up whatever their cases may be. And you get a lot of information from the Maryland website. This is good for our purposes of trying to expunge these records. Of course, there's also the other side of that, where bad guys have access to that, and they can deny you employment or housing a lot more easily based off of this online records. So these records are easy for humans to read. You and I can look at this and determine exactly what it is, but it's really difficult for computers to read. Computers are really good at reading HTML, or they're at least better at it than kind of that what we just saw. And so the first step was to build a parser that takes this information and converts it into computer code. So you have a web scraper, a case number is entered, and this comes back from the server that the courts run. And this is, of course, HTML, which is designed to be displayed. Your browser takes this HTML and it tells you that, okay, this text should be red and the background should be blue or orange. But to us, it's kind of very hard to read. So an algorithm can be created to identify where all the useful information is in that HTML. The case number is going to be this color of text, and it's going to be underneath a line, and it's going to be next to this other line, and that's going to be the case number. Then you move on to the next piece of information you want. The defendant's name is always going to be after the tracking number, whatever it may be, and there's going to be a comma in there. You could build an algorithm, also kind of known as a parser in this sense, to pull that information out. And once you pull that information out, you can convert it into a nice, easy, readable computer array. And once you have it in this format, you can do a lot with it. Because once you have it in this format, you can send it in all kinds of various directions and use all kinds of algorithms and emails and text messages a lot more easily. So once we had the information, we actually had to build the algorithm itself. And so luckily, I had taken expungement law in law school, so I knew the law. And I was able to convert it into code. And so, I literally just sat there with two computer screens, one which had the law, and then the other which had my code developer. And line by line, you kind of just go through and you try to account for every possible variation that's in the law and see if you can account for it in code. And this is freely available. You can go online, you can see what the code actually looks like if you've never seen it before. And the reason we do this is we like people to contribute to the code and to add on to it to kind of make it a community project. And so once you have the code, now you can actually determine the law. You can actually determine a legal analysis. And so how the website works is you're a pro se user, you're an attorney, and you type in a criminal case number. The website will grab that information from the Maryland court's public website. It'll parse the HTML that's returned into an array. The array is run through an algorithm that determines if it's eligible for expungement. And of course, I say likely expungible because this is all automated. So I want to give myself a little wiggle room if there is an error somewhere. And then once you have that determination, that legal determination, that's good. Somebody at least now knows it's eligible for expungement. You got to kind of take it the next step further here, which is then you can populate the documents. And so document population has been around for a long time. And once you have all of the piece of information that you need, and we're very lucky in Maryland that all of the information that you need for the expungement form is generally found online on the court's website, the case number, what you were charged with, the dispositions, and everything that's not there, you can figure out by kind of running it through the algorithm. It's eligible for this reason or that reason, so check this box on the court form, or you can just ask the user to enter the information. And once you have that information in a nice computer array, once it's in that array, you can do a lot with it, and it's very easy to then populate a form, and you can just create the actual expungement form that you need to file with the courts. So the whole process is automated, and what used to take something like 30 minutes to fill out a petition now takes under a minute. And I forget the final count, but I think we're over 100,000 expungement petitions generated using this website in the last 3 or 4 years.
Cool. All right. Anybody have any questions about the Maryland expungement generator experience before we move on?
We don't have any questions yet.
Cool. Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to talk about some tools that we've worked on in Pennsylvania, not just me, and I want to kind of give like a metaphor. I want to offer a metaphor to think about while I'm talking about these different tools. So expungement, the expungement practice it's a complicated practice. You do a lot of different things. There's records. You have to understand the records. You have to analyze the law. You have to apply facts to law, and you have to explain things to different people. I'm hoping that as we talk about these different tools, you can think about. I don't know if you're familiar with. There's a kid's toy called. I think they're called like tessagrams, where the pieces are little shapes, like triangles of different sizes, and squares, and rectangles, and octagons, and things like that. And with these shapes, you put them together into lots of different patterns. So you take like 4 triangles, and you make a bunny rabbit, and you take 6 squares and an octagon, and you make a house. So you have this like set of components that you can put together in lots of different ways to create a whole bunch of different final products that can do different things for you. If you have like 8 things that you need to do, and like 8 different audiences and 8 different processes you need to go through, you can put together a lot of different smaller components to do those different things. So you don't have to rebuild similar tools over and over again. So this idea of like decomposing complicated processes into subcomponents is a really powerful idea, and something that we're trying to use a lot. And I want to talk about what that looks like in Pennsylvania. So in Pennsylvania, the expungement process is similar to the one in Maryland. There's a public-facing website. This website, for anybody who is familiar with web scraping, it's unfortunately not as nice HTML-y as the Maryland website. The dockets themselves are PDFs. It's an ASP website, so it does all kinds of weird sort of live stuff in the background that makes the user experience pretty nice. It does all this stuff automatically, and it doesn't reload pages and things like that. But it makes web scraping a little more challenging. But there is this public website that you can search for somebody's name and get some information. Kathleen Kane is our famous example. She was the Attorney General in Pennsylvania until it was famously convicted of several offenses. Dockets in Pennsylvania look like this. It's a PDF. One thing just to emphasize when we're talking about automation in general, some things computers are really good at and some things computers struggle with. Extracting meaning from a document that's written for humans to read is something that humans are really, 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 really good at. The folks in the employment unit who've been looking at these dockets for years can look at a page like this, and these dockets go on and on and on, and like instantly understand exactly what happened in like this person's whole life. For a computer to be able to figure out that, all right, so it looks like we've got a section called charges, there's a section called disposition, sentencing, and penalties. There's this, if you look at these lines, it starts disposition and case event and sequence disposition and sentencing judge. As a human, you can look at that and be like, oh, this is the table, I get it. These sorts of steps line up to the indentations in the lines below, and the horizontal gray lines indicate, like, separate one charge from another. Like, as a human, you can get that instantly, but a computer has a really, really, really hard time distinguishing those different pieces. So the point here is just that humans are really good at some things, and it's useful to be able to recognize what humans are really good at and what a computer is going to struggle with when you're talking about automating stuff. And then the last part of the expungement process is, you collect the records, you understand the records, you apply some legal logic, and then you have to communicate the results of your analysis. And in the context of expunging somebody's record, the communication or a big part of the communication is write a petition that can be filed with the court. And petitions often have a lot of boilerplate, and just a few blanks get filled in depending on the specific case that you're like expunging. So to compare, to like underline this point about what computers are good at and what humans are good at, a human is really, really, really good at understanding and parsing the very complicated historical fact pattern that a docket describes. A computer is super good at filling in blanks repeatedly and copying text from one place to another without having to understand what any of the text means. So the expungement generator, though, that Mike Hollander wrote many years ago now, and we've been continuing to run at CLS and use a lot, does it all. So it has a very simple interface. You enter somebody's name. The expungement generator behind the scenes is able to scrape the court record site. We've gone through a bunch of different versions of doing that as the site changes over time. And the generator collects dockets and then is able to parse all of those dockets, understand all of those dockets, and then fill out petitions. So they're on the right side of the screen. You can see you download some Word documents that are the petitions that you might file if you were going to try to expunge somebody's record. So the expungement generator is like the whole picture. It's from all you have is your client's name and date of birth, and it gets you all the way to the finding the records, understanding the records, and downloading petitions at the end. So it's like a whole end-to-end solution. So unfortunately, great news in Pennsylvania. The state passed this law clean slate that you may have heard of, that one of the consequences is that lots and lots of records are automatically sealed. Some of them are still expungible, and other things about a person's record depend on records that are sealed. But because they're sealed, we cannot access that information on the public website anymore. And so the expungement generator depends on being able to find dockets on the public website. And once you can't do that, all of its logic about being able to understand someone's record and compare different pieces of the record and figure out what it all means in like a very holistic way doesn't work a lot of the time. So what we did, and this is something that you could do, and the code for this is at this GitHub link below. We made a docassemble document generator guided interview. And Matt's going to talk more about like document assembly later. But all this does is it can't do the hard part for computers. It can't understand the records. It can't draw meaning from a docket. All it does is it asks you to fill in a bunch of blanks. It asks you for the person's name, for their address. It'll ask on subsequent pages. It asks for just for you to write manually all the charges that they've had and what the dispositions of the charges are. And at the end, it will populate a Word document or a set of Word documents that are the petitions that you could then file with the court to expunge or seal the records. So the expungement generator is very smart. It can do a lot of different things throughout this whole process. Clean Slate Buddy just does the one piece that is much easier for a computer to do. But I hope Katie agrees if she uses this or if she's used this in the past that it's still very useful, even if it's not doing the whole process from beginning to end. It's still very useful to be able to automate a chunk of it so that she can focus on the part that is hard for computers, and that she's really good at the legal analysis, understanding dockets, the figuring out context and things like that.
Absolutely, Nate. I will just say I have used this tool many times, and it is much better than having to fill out a whole motion and repeat the same information 5 times in the same motion. Much quicker. We do have some questions from the audience, if we can ask those now. One specifically about the Clean Slate Buddy. Does it retain the information anywhere?
Clean Slate Buddy does not.
Okay. And then we have some previous questions about web scraping. Is any publicly accessible record able to be scraped for data? And what about CAPTCHA checkpoints? Do they prevent a web scraper from working?
Yeah, I can talk to that briefly. So I think kind of theoretically and technically any website can be scraped. The things to look out for are the terms of use. Some organizations will add that into the terms of use that you can't scrape. Legally, it's kind of, a little bit uncertain if that actually prohibits somebody from scraping, but it's something to at least consider before you start scraping. When it comes to CAPTCHAs, that does tend to stop, depending on what type of CAPTCHA, web scrapers, right? That's why they're designed. They're designed to make sure that you're a human and not a robot. That being said, there are lots of ways around CAPTCHAs as well, right? There are click farms where, for a penny a CAPTCHA, you can have somebody type in exactly what the CAPTCHA says, and you can build it into your web scraper. So you can bypass that way. And a lot of websites will use CAPTCHAs that are fairly old, and those have already been broken, and there's tools out there to be able to read them. But you should kind of consider legally whether you should be breaking a CAPTCHA and what the possible consequences of that are, both legally and then from a relationship standpoint as well. If you have a close relationship with the court and you rely on them for a lot of stuff, and then you wind up, breaking their CAPTCHA in terms of use and, bringing down their website because you're pinging it 1,000 times a minute to try to pull out all their records, that can affect it as well. There are, depending on who the web developer is for the court's website, a web dev can make it very difficult for a web scraper if they know you're trying to scrape it and they don't want you to. They can go in and they can change, the smallest CSS change or the smallest way something is formatted, and it'll throw off your scraper and your parser, and you'll have to kind of go in and debug it and rebuild it, and it can be very time consuming. So I think technically, yes, any public accessible record can be scraped, but there is a cost, both monetary and in the amount of time you're going to invest, that some websites it's just not practical to do.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also just add that like data quality can vary a lot too. Like especially if your records are PDFs and you're trying to get text out of a PDF. So if the text is not embedded in the PDF, you have to use optical character recognition. And it can be very error prone. Ink spots show up as punctuation, and that can throw off your scraper, that's looking for a particular word and not expecting to see, periods or hyphens or tildes in weird places. So the data quality can vary too.
And I will say that a lot of these websites are already being scraped heavily. I heard a statistic that in Maryland, a Maryland court website is hit something like between 4 and 6 million times a day. And there's only 6 million people in Maryland. So my guess is the vast majority of those are bots scraping out various information for, programs like the expungement program, or it could be lead generators, or it could be, some group that does their own background search company, kind of stuff like that. So if you're asking that question, it's probably someone's already doing it.
Some more questions. What about websites that are not open to the public, but are open to, for example, an attorney with a login, or are available to the courts? So you can get the information about the record, but it's not a public-facing website.
Yeah. So I think the terms of use then become a lot more important. They're always important to begin with, but especially if you have some kind of private access, and you definitely want to make sure you're not violating it by just opening up, you have your public facing website that just taps into your private account. But you can build automators, especially if it's for your own law firm or, for internal use. It can definitely be a useful tool to have. So yeah, it just gets a little bit more complicated with having to pass usernames and passwords back and forth and keeping sessions alive, but it's definitely doable.
And we also have a question about what if what you can access are PDF printouts of the records. Is there something that you could do with those if they have like a consistent format to create an automated program?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you can apply OCR to PDFs, and there are there are commercial OCR products like Adobe Pro, for example. But there are also open source OCR products, so you can figure out, you can get a computer to tell you what it thinks the text is. It's error prone. Like I said, ink spots become punctuation. Letters get rendered as different letters, and so you end up with all kinds of weird errors that you're going to have to deal with. But yeah, OCR is a very common technology that people use a lot.
Yeah, I'll just add on to that it also depends on how you're scanning in the document. If you have the actual document and you're an attorney, you're going to use your professional Xerox scanner to scan it in, that might work, although you might still hit some of the ink splotch kind of things Nate was talking about. But where I've seen it used in the past is clients have had to take a picture of it with their phone to send it to their attorney, or you're at a clinic that's remote and you're scanning it in very quickly with some cheap scanner. Then it becomes a lot harder because you have to kind of crop stuff out or make sure that your program's able to crop it out. It's doable. It just, the difficulty goes up and the chance for error goes up.
I have a question follow up from you, Nate. When you refer to OCR, what is an OCR?
OCR is the technique. It's optical character recognition, if I'm not mistaken, and it's a technique that lots of different kinds of software can use to look at an image and make some very smart guesses about what the characters are in that image. So if it looks like an R, we think it's an R. If it looks like a Q, then I think it's a Q.
Right, and if it's handwritten, you're almost out of luck. It's almost not really worth building because handwriting stuff is really hard to even try to OCR. And so as long as it's a printout, you have a decent shot. But as soon as even if you have, clerks, or if it's coming from, the police officer or something that's writing it in, that just becomes almost impossible.
And a question about how these programs are used. Are they used to enhance the productivity of attorneys, or are they used for pro se individuals, or both?
Well, both, I think.
Yeah, go ahead, Nate.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I have some examples of coming up about using things for like public, using these kinds of tools for use with the public. But Matthew, I think also you were telling us that the Maryland expunsion generator has a dual purpose as well.
Yeah, I actually have an app or a slide coming up on that. So it's a great question, and it'll be answered shortly.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, Katie, any other questions before we?
We have a few more questions, but if you guys want to keep going, I think we'll
Okay.
questions as we.
All right, cool. All right, cool. So I wanted to talk about a couple other like limited projects that that are just examples of other testograms that you can make out of pieces of the expungement related process. So another process another project that we were working on. So Pennsylvania passed this law. We wanted to tell everyone in Pennsylvania, like, hey, there's this great new law. It could mean that your record's going to get cleared, or it could mean that you're eligible for like legal services and help that you weren't eligible for before. So we wanted to offer to do a large number of screenings for people across Pennsylvania to give them some information about whether they're eligible for what kinds of expungement and sealing related services. So the employment unit we don't have an entire end-to-end solution that we could open up to the public and let anybody sign up, and it would magically do the lawyer's whole job of figuring out all their whole criminal history and doing a complicated analysis and explaining their whole, all their options to them clearly. So what they did is they just put up a simple sign-up sheet where you could put in your name and your email address and some other like very basic information, and then humans would review that information and do an analysis, a basic analysis of what they're eligible for. It very quickly though became clear that humans were not going to be able to communicate all of that efficiently enough. So we ended up getting many thousands of requests for personal screenings. And the actual legal part is really hard, and we don't have tools for computers to do that part. But what we were able to figure out how to do is use a spreadsheet and some sort of templating to come up with a way for a human to just pick pick the results of their analysis. Like this person is eligible for a pardon, or this person is not eligible for anything, or this person is, etc. And then click a button. And what you see on the picture here is the top where you see draft email. That draft email is a button that when you click that button, the spreadsheet reads a row of the spreadsheet and looks at the next step that the lawyer picked for that person, and reads their name and from a different column, and reads their date of birth from a different column, and reads what county they live in from a different column, and puts together an email by just stitching together a bunch of different blocks of text. And it drafts that email and sticks that email into the outbox of an email account. And so from there, at least the code, the software is not doing the whole analysis, but the software is doing the like really, really, really boring part of the analysis, which is like writing the same email 8,000 times. So just that part was able to help automate sort of like the worst part of like a very rote process. But we do want to get to the next level of having a more of an end-to-end service. So that's what we're slowly building over time, and that's kind of another like underlying takeaway point that you can build components one piece at a time and end up with a full end-to-end service without having to build the whole thing at once. So the employment unit worked with a marketing company to actually build this really nice, polished front-end website, mycleanslatepa.com, and plan this project in a few different stages. The first stage is just to have this website. It provides information. You can click this get help with your criminal record button, and you would fill in some basic contact information, and you get some instructions, just like static instructions about how to understand your criminal record, how to figure it out yourself. And then the second step is to hook this front end up to a web service that we run that scrapes the court site. So going back a few slides, if you remember, Pennsylvania has this public website. You can put somebody's name into it and get back a search result of their criminal history. So the second step is to just duplicate that, to have a service running in the background of the fancy front end that goes to the public website, does the search on the public website, and then just returns the results back to the user. It's still very dumb. Like it doesn't understand what any of that means. It doesn't understand what a docket is. It doesn't know anything about the court records. It doesn't understand the contents of any of the criminal history. All it does is just repeat the search history. But what that does let us do is this site now is a lot more engaging because it takes you directly to your criminal history, and it gives some like dynamic feedback about your eligibility for services. And what we're working on now is the final piece. So we're collecting the records, we can do the searches, and we're working on filling in that last piece where we actually get the records, understand them, and write an entire document that explains in clear language what your record is, what rules, how different rules apply to your record, and whether you're likely eligible for services and where you can get services and things like that. So we're working on building, so like one step at a time, we're building this thing that the first stage was great, second stage even better, last stage is the like full end-to-end service, and it's useful at every point along the way. We're just adding components over time. So we wanted to go through a couple examples of like specific tools that folks could use and programs could use that maybe don't require a lot of coding or any coding, don't require a software engineer. If you've got a software engineer on your staff, that's awesome. Or if you work with one, that's awesome. But we wanted to give some ideas about tools that you could use that don't require that like level of like financial commitment to software development. So before we do that, Katie, do we want to like pause here to talk about anything, or?
I think we can answer some of these questions later if you want to keep going.
Okay, cool. All right, so I'm going to start by just talking about Google Forms. So Google Forms is potentially a really useful, very quick way to build a very simple screening service. So I'm assuming lots of the folks here work for nonprofits. Nonprofits can get a G Suite account for free. The Google for G Suite for nonprofits, it comes with Gmail and Drive and Slides and all the Google apps that you're familiar with. Maybe some of you are already use G Suite. You could, like, if you could have your project use its own Gmail account, but that's sort of if the account's not administered by the organization, you can run into various problems. So having an enterprise G Suite account where that you run things through, I think is strongly recommended. So anyway, so you can sign up your nonprofit up for G Suite and you get access to all these really useful tools. And one of the really useful tools is Google Forms. Google Forms lets you, you go to Google Drive, you say you want a new document, you pick a form. And what that lets you do is it gives you this nice little interface for creating a web form. You add a bunch of questions. In this case, I'm making a form called My Helpful Service and ask a question, are you friendly? And I decide that the answers are going to be multiple choice. There's a nice friendly little drop down. You can say what kinds of answers you want it to be. Is this question a text answer? Is it a multiple choice? Is it radio buttons? Is it a select box of whatever it is that you want? And so it has this nice graphic interface for building a form. And it really only takes a few minutes to build your form, depending on how many questions there are, of course. And when you're done, there's a nice purple send button in the corner that you can share your form. You get a link that you could embed that link on your organization's website, or you could email it to your community outreach partners or whoever you're trying to interact with in this context. And then people will be able to click that link and they'll get to, they'll go to a website that will be the form with a submit button at the end, and you can collect the answers to the questions. You, on the back end, will collect the answers to the questions in a spreadsheet. So automatically, all the answers to your forms get stuck into a spreadsheet in your Google Drive account. And it's a spreadsheet, which you're probably quite familiar with. It's got rows and columns, and all the information is collected there, and you can review it quickly and see, if you're looking for trends or whatever. And then for each, row, maybe you're doing some sort of analysis. So, maybe we're trying to figure out, are the people in our state friendly? And they, if they say yes, okay, those people are friendly. But if they say no, oh, maybe they're not friendly. So you can do your analysis, you can note your analysis, and then you can use something like mail merges to do the document generation piece of the communication piece of your process. And doing a mail merge is super easy. You would do sort of weirdly, Google Drive doesn't actually do mail merges itself. You would need add-on software, which I haven't vetted any particular one, so I don't use. But you can download your spreadsheet, and you can open it up in Excel, and you can do a mail merge using Microsoft Word, and you can write a template document that will pull in the data from your survey, from your form, and generate the communication piece of your workflow. So in this way, you can build out of just these very accessible tools that you have access to now or could pretty easily get access to, a screening system that maybe asks people for information about, if they're looking for information about their criminal record, and then you can collect some information about them through a Google form, download it as a spreadsheet, do your analysis, and then use a mail merge to draft the communications that you send back to back to the people that that need to hear the results of your legal analysis. And the legal analysis part, you can just do yourself. The software here is not sophisticated enough to do complicated like rule parsing and things like that, but it can do the boring stuff that that will give you time to do the like interesting legal parts.
Okay,
And,
so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these guided interview software programs that exist that are kind of available and kind of easy to use if you don't have tech skills. Now, if you do have a developer, I highly suggest you go that route. You just get a lot more flexibility when you code it from scratch than you ever will from any kind of do-it-yourself automated interview software. But if you don't have a developer, you can't code, there are still ways that you can do this. You just sometimes lose a little bit of functionality. So here are three of them that I picked: Dockymate, Neotologic, and EndtoEnd. And they all work on the same general principle. So the first thing is you have to create questions, right? And all these programs do a good job of giving you a nice graphic interface to create the questions. And that piece is fairly straightforward. You know, what's your name? What county? Do you live in Maryland? Whatever the required information may be. And the next piece is the logic. And they all have, this is kind of where they all differ in how they do this logic component. But I would say that they all do it in a fairly understandable and learnable way. They just have their different preferences, and you may like one and not the other. But you can see the one on the left here is from Dockymate, and it basically says show question 3 if the question on vesting is answered with the answer other. And so it can be a very straightforward drop down graphic user interface. You don't actually need to know or do any coding. EndtoEnd, they can actually show you the code. You can edit it a little bit. And they also have a nice kind of GUI interface as well. When it comes to what the user sees, this is kind of one drawback is you have to basically use the UX or the user design that the software comes with. And so on the left is EndtoEnd, and if you like that format of how they do the guided interviews, that's great because that's your only option. Same with Dockymate and Neotologic. But they give you some minor places where you can tweak kind of background colors and stuff like that. But for the most part, you're stuck with the format they have. On the plus side, because it's the only format you have, they tend to do a good job of making it look professional. It's just one limitation. So they all do document automation as well. And the way this works is, let's say you have a Word document. Inside the Word document, you will add your variable names, and you have to add them in a way that the program can pick out the variables. And they all do this by injecting them or surrounding the variable names with something that's not usually in a Word document. So for Dockymate, it's these 2 curly brackets that are surrounding a variable name. And so wherever you want the employee name to go, or wherever you want the address, the court address to go, you would just put those, you would name the variable on their website when you're building out the guided interview, and then in the Word document, you would add that variable name surrounded by curly brackets. And Dockymate has a Word kind of plugin as well that makes it a little bit more straightforward. Something similar for PDFs. Right, obviously you can have fillable PDFs, and the way to do this is you just name the fields with a specific name you're going to recognize, and then usually you either have to name them the same as the variable that you create when you create it on the website side, or you have to at some point link up, the field called court location should be filled with the variable called court location 1 or 2 or whatever it may be. So these programs can be a little time consuming to kind of learn how they do everything, but you don't actually have to know any code for it. And I think what 40% or so said they kind of see themselves as Microsoft Office extraordinaires. And so if you know how to do a mail merge, and you know how to do kind of Excel formulas and things like that, you should be able to figure these programs out. And so if you're interested in trying to replicate some of the automation that we showed you here with the Pennsylvania project or MD expungement, you can do big pieces of it. There are parts of it, you know, OCR and web scraping are going to be a little bit more difficult, if not impossible. But you could still automate pieces of it where the defendant or the client or the attorney enters in the information and populates a form.
All right.
I think that's you, right, Nate?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. So we wanted to talk about the sort of last series of slides is about you know, what next. We hopefully have entertained you for a while through our like discussions of different software. But like, what do you take away? What can you take away from the webinar today? So one thing that we've talked a lot about being a significant need that people have is recognizing that everybody needs more resources to do this kind of work. You know, I'm at CLS. I'm super fortunate to be at an organization that actually has somebody like me to do this job. But like, I still also want more resources to have more sophisticated infrastructure, access to different kinds of software tools, access to more development expertise, and other coders to do work. And so, how do we? What have we figured out about how to find those resources? What places are there that you can go to get help? So there are kind of three categories that I think are useful to talk about. The first is expertise. You need somebody to do the work, and you know, if your like tool is Google Forms and Microsoft Word, or if your tool is maybe A to J Author, these sorts of like visual guided interview tools. You know, you may not need to like hire a coder at your organization, but you still need somebody to develop expertise with those particular tools. There are different ways to hire. If you're going to try to hire programmers, if you're looking for coding help, there are lots of different techniques. You can try to hire somebody on staff, and I think this is what I recommend. I recommend you should hire a lawyer who can code. There aren't a ton of them, but we're very useful, and the reasons that we're useful will sort of become apparent as we talk about some of the other options and their shortcomings. So one really common thing that I hear about is, oh, Code for America. Code for America is it's a association of programmers, data scientists. They have volunteer brigades all over the country of very expert coders and data scientists and others who are looking for civic hacking projects. They're looking for software projects to work on that are that somehow benefit society or benefit marginalized groups. It can be challenging working with volunteer programmers in general, whether it's Code for America or you know, college students or whoever it is, for the same reasons that it's challenging working with volunteer lawyers working on cases, because volunteers come and go. You know, you're not paying them, and so their priority is just it's never going to be your project. And there's also there's a gulf, sort of an expertise gulf between you know, a lawyer who doesn't do any technology work and someone who only does technology work. It's hard for them to have a good discussion about what the product should be. And also, I think coders tend to come from a more like corporate their metaphors are all more corporate and business oriented. So they're going to ask you about like your business needs and like what are your customers, like how do you get conversions with your customers and things like that. That all these metaphors that like don't really jive with within like the legal services world. Um, so expertise is hard to find, but I think hiring somebody is, I think, something that is worth prioritizing, even though it's obviously really hard to do. Matthew, do you want to add anything? Do you want to add anything to expertise?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it. There's pros and cons, and I think we only have a few minutes left here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
But if you're looking to learn a new specific piece of technology, I think YouTube is kind of overlooked. There's a tutorial on YouTube for almost anything you're trying to learn, and that includes all of this software. If you liked A to J Author, Documented, Neotologic, there's 1,000 different videos that'll teach you how to do that. So if you need to do it yourself, try using YouTube to kind of get you started on that. So I hear this a lot. I'm going to go pretty quick so we can leave some time for questions at the end. But while I hear this all the time, I'm going to be going to the computer science department at my local university, and I'll get them to build it for me. And I can tell you this is not going to work. There's already a huge line of people who have had the same idea. Students are much more interested in building their own next Snapchat idea than they are kind of building a document generator for your organization. And students, they have busy lives. They have internships, exams, homework, summers and spring breaks, and they're college students. And so any kind of project that has a tight deadline or is attached to a really big grant and needs to happen, it's kind of a roll of the dice unless you can really manage and you have some really good students that have kind of proven themselves in the past. And so then the obvious next step is finding a developer, right? Unfortunately, that's not quite easy, right? And Nate went over a lot of this. They're expensive. They switch jobs quickly. And you might think, oh, well, I need one app, so I'll get one developer. But computer science makes up a lot of different areas. And so there might be a big database component and a front end and a back end, and you can try to hire a jack of all trades. And I in the past have built things that are back end and front end, but there are people who specialize in each of these. And depending on how important the project is or the value of the data going back and forth, if it's social security numbers, you might not want a jack of all trades. You might need somebody who's really good at just database management or just cybersecurity, something like that. Sorry, Nate, do you have anything?
No.
So this is kind of in relation to that question that I was asked earlier. MD expungement started out as a pro se facing tool. And almost instantly, it became a tool used almost entirely by attorneys. And the vast majority of them were legal aid attorneys or public defenders. And they were cranking out 100 in a day or something like that at these massive expungement clinics. But we had built it for pro se use. So we had a ton of warnings, and we took it slow so we could explain the instructions and what each step meant for the client. And we wouldn't allow certain petitions to be printed if the algorithm determined that it was clearly not eligible for expungement, or if we didn't have a certain piece of information. And the attorneys wanted all of that gone. They said, I know this isn't eligible, but I have my crafty legal reason that I'm going to file, and I plan to take this to the Supreme Court, all of that. And so I just need the petition so I can get the process started. And so we had to go back and unblock all of those, remove a lot of the warnings that attorneys said they found annoying. We had to create an account system so that attorneys could have their information populated in all the forms. And so we would have saved ourselves a lot more time had we kind of spent a little bit more time thinking about who was actually going to benefit and use this website the most. And if I could do it again, I would have built it attorney facing to begin with rather than pro se facing. And right now it's both, but it would have been easier to build it attorney facing primarily with a pro se kind of secondary component. Another thing to keep an eye out for is the law changes, right? And it changes frequently. In Maryland, the expungement law has changed every year for the last 5 years. So any algorithm you build, if you pour 200 hours of time into it, you can't just, push it out to the world and then, wipe your hands of it and walk away. You might have to update that algorithm every year or sooner than that. And this is true of Pennsylvania, right? When Hollander built the first one, ceiling didn't even exist.
Yeah. Also, this is also a reason why it's really useful to have technical expertise on staff, because every software project needs care and maintenance over time. It's a plant. It's not a machine. You have to water it. You have to prune it. You need to be constantly maintaining it, and it's not like you don't just write it once and then it runs forever.
Yep. This is just if you want to build a web scraper. Court websites change all the time. You can't just build one web scraper and call it a day. This happened in Maryland. They removed a particular piece of information off of the website that was used in the algorithm to determine if something was eligible for expungement. And we had to kind of scramble to rebuild the web scraper. And then we had one time when even the slightest CSS change, you couldn't even determine it just by looking at it. They changed how the HTML was populated, but it threw off the scraper, and that can happen all the time. So just be prepared that you might have to go back and change it if you build a web scraper. The court filing procedures, right? You might have, this is the form that you need to file, right? Court forms change all the time. Court procedures change. Judges might, like forms to be one way or have a piece of information on it that wasn't included in the beginning. And so even this piece needs to be updated on your program every time it changes. And this goes to what Nate was saying, where having a subject matter expert on staff who's actually watching for these changes, because some of them might not even be publicized. If a judge denies every expungement because it doesn't have the attorney's bar number on it, that might not be an official court rule. That just might be their preference. And unless you have some attorney who knows what's going on in the courthouse, you're not going to know to fix that. And then finally, tech just gets outdated at times, right? Whatever software you're using might be on a version that in 2 years is no longer supported. And once things are no longer supported, you definitely don't want to have sensitive information going back and forth. So just, you got to keep track of that. And at times you may have to rebuild parts of your program just because the tech you originally relied on no longer exists. The company went out of business. They're onto a new version. They're not supporting it anymore. Whatever it may be. So there are lots of challenges that go along with building a tech project. And I try to make sure that everyone is kind of cognizant of that when they build a tech project. It's not just one and done and you're good to go. It's as Nate was saying, it's something you kind of have to maintain over the course of its life. And then I'll just go through a couple of these really quick here. These are just other tips that I wish I had known early on. If you're doing a guided interview, keep the questions to a minimum. Attorneys, I found, are very bad at this. They want to ask every possible question for every possible scenario the law could envision. Nobody's going to use that program if there's hundreds of questions that account for every possibility. At some point, you're just going to have to assume that there's, just take 99% of people fall into this bucket, and we'll add a warning on the final slide or the final page of the website. Because a program that has 100 questions and is 100% accurate but never gets used is not a good program. And then if you are asking questions, ask the ones that disqualify people first. Don't have them fill out a whole bunch of personal information and at the very end say, oh, by the way, are you a US citizen? And then they answer no, and they can't use the program, or the forms are different or something like that. So I think that's it. Here's our contact information. I'm always interested in kind of legal tech ideas. If you want to run something by me, if you have a website that you want to know if this is an easy to scrape website or a hard to scrape website or something that could be converted into an algorithm or not, I'm always happy to talk legal tech. It doesn't take a whole lot. So feel free to shoot me an email or to follow me on Twitter and ask me a question.
Likewise, I don't use Twitter, but otherwise the same.
Okay, thank you guys so much. We have a few more questions. We get this question a lot, so let me start with this. Confidentiality issues when it comes to tech, when people are providing their information, when you're using technology to, auto-populate things and to communicate with people with things. What are the confidentiality concerns, and how do you handle those?
Yeah, so I can just talk a little bit. I think it comes down to, if you don't need to collect it, don't collect it. If you don't need a social security number, don't collect it, because once you start collecting some of that really sensitive information, you just become a much bigger target. And there are a lot of websites that don't collect any information just for that reason, that it'll kind of hold it temporarily in kind of a session while you're logged in, populate the form, and then it gets rid of it. So if that's an option, I would go that way. Otherwise, you definitely want to make sure that you use that or you make sure that you take steps to do whatever you can to encrypt or hold it in the back of the database. And it's not always easy, because it's not fun. It doesn't really add value to your program, right? But I trust me that whatever money you save by not encrypting it or whatever it is on the front end, you will lose very quickly as soon as some Russian hacker robot comes by, steals your data, and you get some email that says, I have your data, now send me $10,000, or I put it on the internet.
Yeah, it's hugely context dependent. You want to make your attack surface as small as possible, like Matthew was saying, and and balance that against your need to provide the services, and try to find the right reasonable place that that collects the information you need, but protects it in whatever ways are appropriate. And it totally depends. There are a million different ways of configuring any given tool. So it's hugely dependent on all sorts of factors going into it. But yeah,
and
it's
you might
complicated.
think
Try
that,
not to.
yeah, and you might think, I'm just a small legal aid group in the middle of some much bigger state. No one's ever, no hacker's going to try to hack me. There are automated tools that hackers use to scan millions of websites looking for known vulnerabilities. And so it's not necessarily just the known hacker who has a grudge against you and is spending, weeks on end trying to find a vulnerability on your website. There's just automated tools that just run looking for vulnerabilities and data to steal. And so, security through obscurity only works to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Okay, and we have a question about kind of the cost of all this. If you all know what the cost was in, man hours, in actual dollars that went into the programs you talked in the beginning that actually create these motions, create the websites and create the motions. And if you could just talk a little bit about the cost-benefit analysis when it comes to using tech generally.
Nate, you want
I
to
don't have any
start that?
numbers. Yeah, with all of the tools that I talked about, except for Microsoft Word, they're all the software is free. There's like a huge, amazing ecosystem of open source software. The languages that we write the software in, those languages are open source. The libraries to do parsing and scraping and all those things, those are all open source. The software is all free. The man hours, that I don't really know I don't know how to estimate. I mean, the expungement generator, all of these tools, the expungement generator took years to build, and we're still maintaining it. We're still spending time maintaining it. Something like Clean Slate Buddy didn't take that long to build. It took maybe like a week to just set up the forms, but we maintain it. It takes time to keep running it. So in terms of time, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of right on the money. I mean, the money it costs to upkeep MD expungement is $10 a month in AWS costs, which, you know, in the grand scheme of things is nothing. But it did take a long time to build. Now, I will say that pushing out a minimal viable product or something that at least goes from A to B, you know, that can be done in a couple of weeks, but it kind of follows the 90-10 rule, where, you know, you do 90% of the work, 90% of the work takes 10% of the time, and then that last 10% of error bugging and updating and realizing that, you know, your user is using a company computer and they only have Internet Explorer version 2, and so now you got to go back and, you know, try to update it so that it works with that. That takes up a lot of time. So it depends on how wide your reach is and what you're going to define success as. Oh, sorry, what was the end part of that question?
Sorry, just what is the, like, how, if an organization is listening to this and thinking, well, it would be really nice for us to have one of these programs that scrapes our, you know, website and pre-populates motions and does some analysis for us and figures out, you know, takes a lot of, automates a lot of our current processes. But, you know, we don't have money lying around to pay for this. How should these organizations be thinking through the cost benefit analysis of doing this?
Yes, that's what, and it's a great question, because if you build a program that does, you know, 80% and you're able to increase your volume substantially, but the part that still does 20%, you still have the same number of staff members or staff time, then the bottleneck still exists, and so you're still going to create a level of stress that, and you might not even be able to get the efficiency that you were predicting. So if you can, try to get funding that's based around the numbers that you do. And so, you know, if you're able to get funding to build an expungement website like one of the ones you saw here today, the funding should be based off that. So if you're helping more people, you're printing more petitions, you're able to do more expungement clinics because of that, you should try to get funding based off of that. And I know that's really tricky to do, but it's, especially in the nonprofit world, it can be very difficult, where some funders say, you know, well, you know, we only have X amount of dollars to give you, whether you help 100 people or 1,000 people. And if the tool doesn't automate 100% of the process, and you're still adding on a significant burden to your staff without any additional compensation to go hire more staff. And so it's a tough question that I have lots of, I don't have a whole lot of answers for, just a lot of kind of gripe sessions that I can have with you.
Yeah, when the project is successful, the scale that you can reach when you successfully automate something is completely different from the scale when you have like one person sitting down with one client and doing everything by hand. But figuring out how to put a number on that is not something I've been able to do.
Yeah, I think you just have to get creative with the grant, the people you go and you get your grants from, and make sure you have a good grants writer who is brought in on the project and can pitch it to different, because funders love having this automation, but you need to approach them in a way that if this is successful, we're going to need more money on a you know, kind of a scale.
And in your experience, or have you seen that there are fewer attorneys necessary to actually do the same amount of work once this tech has been developed?
Not in expungement. In expungement, there's so many people who need records expunged that the need for attorneys to, you know, because there's still trouble with filing them, and it's still beneficial in a lot of instances to have an attorney file it on your behalf. There's filing fee waivers, and then there's kind of some court procedures that make it better to have an attorney. And so, you know, I understand everybody's apprehension about tech coming and replacing attorneys, but at least when it comes to expungement, it's only increased the demand for attorneys to use these tools. And I'll add one extra thing to that is, we've actually had more success getting attorneys, because attorneys can do more of the fun face-to-face client stuff and actual legal determination rather than the tedious form population and navigating long chains of websites to get various pieces of information. And so it's actually, we've had more luck because attorneys find it more fun to actually practice law when they use these tools.
That's a great point.
All right, well, thank you guys both so much. We're at the very end of our time. And so I think we need to wrap it up here. But I want to thank Nate and Matt. This has been an incredibly helpful presentation covering simple tools all the way to tools that do require a developer to be hired and used. So I hope everyone has found that helpful. We will send a follow-up email that will have a copy of the PowerPoint and also a recording of the webinar once we have that up. And everyone is encouraged to attend our webinar next week at the same time, and we'll be sending a follow-up email with more information about that. All right, thank you.
Thanks so much.
You.